For decades, Blackwood Forest has been the scene of a long list of unexplained disappearances. At first, they were just rumors, hunters who never returned, hikers who vanished without a trace, or distant screams that no one knew where they came from. Over time, the inhabitants of the small village nearby learned to live in fear, avoiding going too far into the forest. However, Anna, a young journalist from a nearby town, did not believe in ghost stories or urban legends. Determined to unravel the mystery, Anna took her recording equipment and, against the warnings of the locals, went into Blackwood. She knew that the disappearances had been hushed up by the local police, who attributed them to accidents or simply unsolved cases. To her, it was a conspiracy, a perfect story for her career. But what she didn't know was that the disappearances were not accidents. As Anna advanced through the trees, the forest became denser and quieter. The sunlight seemed to be swallowed by the thicket, and a strange mist began to envelop the path she followed. After hours of walking, he found an old cabin that did not appear on any maps or police reports. Its walls were covered with moss and the door seemed to have been sealed by time, but there was an eerie atmosphere around it, as if something inside the cabin was waiting for her. Anna, determined to continue her investigation, pushed the door, which gave way with a sharp creak. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of dampness and confinement. The main room was nearly empty, save for a table and a few dust-covered chairs. However, something caught his eye, an old metal box, tucked away in a corner. Inside, he found a series of photos. As he looked through them, his heart skipped a beat. They were pictures of missing people. Some of the faces were of people whose disappearances had been widely covered by the media, others seemed to belong to cases never reported. But the most disturbing was at the bottom of the pile, a photo of himself, taken at the entrance to the forest earlier that day. Fear gripped Anna. Someone was watching her. She ran out of the cabin, feeling the trees closing in on her, as if the forest had become aware of her presence. The sounds of branches snapping around her indicated that she was not alone. Something was following her. In her flight, she stumbled over roots and branches, until she reached the main path again, or so she thought. The path was no longer the same. The trees had changed, and the fog was so thick that she could barely see a few meters in front of her. She felt trapped, as if the forest had claimed her. Desperate, Anna looked for the exit, but she seemed to be walking in circles. The cabin kept reappearing in front of her, no matter how hard she ran in the opposite direction. Panicking, her flashlight flickered, and her camera battery was about to run out. The footsteps behind her became clearer, but when she turned her head, she saw nothing. Finally, exhausted, she decided to take refuge in the cabin again, thinking that perhaps she could find some clue to escape. Inside, the atmosphere seemed darker, more suffocating. Then, she heard a rustling sound behind her. She turned quickly and saw a hooded figure standing in the doorway, blocking her exit. The figure said nothing, just watched her with a disturbing calmness. Anna tried to scream, but her voice did not come out. Fear paralyzed her when she saw that, in the figure's hand, he was holding a camera. It was hers. She had been being watched the whole time. The image faded as the screen of her camera went out for good. Weeks later, another reporter was sent to Blackwood to investigate her disappearance. All they found was her camera, lying on the floor of the cabin. When they reviewed the photos, one in particular stood out. It was a recent photo of Anna, standing in front of the woods, with the same vacant eyes and absent expression as the other victims. As if she had been absorbed into the forest itself. No one went back into Blackwood after that. In the North Country, winters are long and cold, and the forests seem endless. For decades, the inhabitants of the small towns that border these forests have lived by an unwavering warning: never go into the woods when autumn is about to end. This warning was not just superstition, but a warning based on a series of mysterious disappearances. Every year, in the transition from autumn to winter, someone would go into the forest and never return. There were never any traces, no bodies, only the silence of the forest and strange marks carved into the trees, which the locals called the seal of the hunter. The person responsible for these disappearances was known as the Shadow Hunter. A killer who, according to legend, melted into the shadows of the forest, waiting patiently for his victims. No one had ever seen his face, but the marks left on the trees indicated that his presence was real. The few who tried to hunt him down or discover his identity ended up being the next to disappear. Despite the warnings, 3 friends David, Marcos and Julia decided to take on the legend. Young and brave, they believed they could solve the mystery and emerge unscathed, becoming local heroes. Equipped with flashlights, cameras and a bit of swagger, they set out into the forest during the twilight of a cold October evening. The group walked confidently at first, joking and recording their adventure, as if it were a simple stroll. David led the group, following an old map he had found in a local bookstore. The map pointed out certain key spots where disappearances had been reported and where the shadow hunter's marks had been seen. The 3 were determined to get to the heart of the forest, where they believed they could find the hunter's lair. As they advanced, the atmosphere began to change. The forest, which at first was dense but welcoming, began to become darker and more claustrophobic. The shadows between the trees seemed to lengthen unnaturally, and the silence became eerie. There were no birds, no insects, only the rustle of dry leaves underfoot. Suddenly, Mark was the first to see it, a mark on a tree, carved deep into the bark. It was a strange symbol, like a spiral surrounded by irregular lines. Julia took a picture while David moved on. Soon, more marks began to appear on the trees around them, forming a path that led them deeper into the forest. There was no doubt, they were following the hunter's trail. Night fell quickly, and with it, a thick fog began to cover the ground. The flashlights barely illuminated a few meters ahead. As they advanced, the cold became unbearable, but most unsettling was the feeling of being watched. There were no obvious noises, but a palpable presence surrounded them, as if something or someone was walking just out of range of the light. David insisted on following, convinced that they were close to discovering the truth. However, the tension was palpable. Julia began to hear whispers, as if the shadows were talking to them. Mark tried to reassure her, but his own nerves were beginning to crumble. Suddenly, they heard a loud cracking sound. When they turned around, Marcos was gone. There was no screaming, no sign of a struggle, just Marcos's flashlight lying on the ground, still lit, but no sign of him. Panic seized David and Julia. They decided to turn back, but the path had changed. The marks on the trees, which had once formed a clear trail, were now everywhere, confusing their steps. The forest seemed to have transformed, as if it was playing with them. As they tried to find their way out, they saw something moving through the trees, a tall, dark figure that seemed to fade into the shadows every time they tried to focus on it with the flashlights. Julia began to cry, pleading for them to get out of there, but David, driven by his stubbornness, kept going. He said that if they caught the hunter, it would all have been worth it. But the figure moved closer, and with each movement, the lantern lights seemed to flicker, as if something was absorbing its energy. Finally, the figure revealed itself. It was not a man, not a being of flesh and blood. It was a shadow, a dark entity that seemed to form and unform to the rhythm of his breaths. It had no face, but its presence spoke volumes. They had been hunted from the moment they entered the forest. Julia, in shock, ran away, but her scream faded in the distance. David followed her, shouting her name, but the echo of the forest was all that answered him. Alone, without light and surrounded by shadows, he heard one last whisper close to his ear, "You're in my hunt." The people never saw David, Julia, or Marcos again. Their bodies were never found, but months later, someone found their cameras, dumped in a hollow in the woods. The recordings revealed the group's final moments, shadows moving, distorted voices, and in the last frame, a dark figure standing behind David, hands outstretched toward his neck. No one has entered that forest since. The marks on the trees keep appearing, reminding the inhabitants that the shadow hunter is still there, waiting for the next to challenge his territory. Ravenmore Forest is known for its density and oppressive atmosphere. Shrouded in fog for much of the year, it is a place that locals stay away from. At its center is an old cabin that has been the subject of stories for generations. No one knows exactly when it was built or by whom, but all agree that it is a cursed place. Those who have approached the cabin, according to rumors, have heard whispers, soft, almost imperceptible voices calling their names, inviting them to enter. No one who has crossed its threshold has returned to tell what happened inside. Sarah and Tom, a young couple, were skeptical of such legends. Both were fans of the paranormal, and the mystery of the cabin seemed like the perfect place for a new adventure. They decided to spend a night there, defying the warnings of the nearby villagers. To them, it was all just folklore. With backpacks loaded with equipment and cameras, they entered the forest with the intention of documenting their experience. What they didn't know was that the cabin was not just an old and abandoned place, but a trap for the unwary, a place where time and reality worked differently. The walk to the cabin was longer than they expected. The trail, which at first was clear and easy to follow, soon became lost in the thicket of the forest. The trees seemed to close in on each other, as if they were closing in. Sarah sensed that something was not right. Although the day was not yet over, the sunlight seemed to be waning faster than usual, and a strange feeling of heaviness began to creep over them. Finally, the cabin appeared before them. It was smaller and more dilapidated than they had expected. Its windows were broken, and the wood of the walls was blackened by moisture and the passage of time. However, what caught Sarah's attention was not the dilapidated state of the place, but the absolute silence that surrounded it. There were no animal sounds, not even the rustle of the wind through the trees. It was as if the cabin was isolated from the world. As they approached the door, they both heard the same thing, whispers, faint but clear, calling their names. Sarah stopped immediately, her heart pounding in her chest, but Tom, more reckless, smiled brightly. "It's what we came for," he said, convinced that it was all part of the paranormal experience they so longed for. They opened the door, and a deep chill enveloped them as they crossed the threshold. The inside of the cabin was empty, save for an old table and a fallen chair. There were marks on the walls, symbols they didn't recognize, as if someone had tried to communicate with something or someone. Tom turned on his camera and began recording, while Sarah cautiously inspected the walls. Every time she approached one of the windows, she thought she saw shadows moving outside, but every time she looked directly, there was nothing. Hours passed, and as night fell, the whispers became more persistent. They were no longer just coming from the walls, but also from the floor, the ceiling, and the shadows cast in the small room. Sarah began to feel watched, vulnerable. She proposed to leave, but Tom refused, thrilled with the recordings he was getting. Suddenly, they heard a loud noise. Something was banging on the cabin door from outside. Tom, thinking it was some local's prank, went outside to investigate, leaving Sarah alone inside. As the door closed behind him, the whispers inside the cabin intensified. They were more than voices now, they were wails, pleas, as if hundreds of souls were trapped in the walls, begging to be released. Sarah, paralyzed with fear, tried to open the door to follow Tom, but the handle would not budge. The air grew heavier, and the lantern lights began to flicker. As she struggled to remain calm, the whispers became clearer, more insistent. "Sarah, stay with us, don't go." Outside, Tom found nothing, only the thick darkness of the forest. But when he returned, he realized something terrifying: the cabin had changed. It wasn't the same one he had left minutes before. The windows were sealed, the walls looked older, and the door, the one he had left ajar, was now locked tight. He knocked with all his might, calling out to Sarah, but there was no answer. Inside, Sarah was trapped. The hut was no longer a simple shelter, it was a prison. The whispering went on, and shadows began to take shape. At first, they were blurry silhouettes moving out of the corner of her eye, but soon they became more tangible, more present. Human figures, made of darkness, emerged from the walls surrounding her. Desperate, Sarah tried to break one of the windows, but it was as if sealed by an invisible force. She peered through a small crack and saw Tom, on the other side, banging on the door and shouting her name. He tried to shout, but his voice wouldn't come out. It was as if the cabin had absorbed his scream. Finally, one of the shadows, the tallest of them all, approached her. Unintelligible whispers came out of its misty form, and when it extended a hand towards Sarah, everything went dark. Outside, Tom saw something that petrified him. Through the broken window, he saw Sarah's figure, but something wasn't right. Her gaze was vacant, and her skin seemed pale, almost translucent. She seemed to be looking at him, but did not react to his cries. Suddenly, she disappeared from the window, as if she had never been there. The door of the cabin opened slowly, and Tom, trembling, entered. But there was no sign of Sarah. Only her camera, lying on the floor, was still recording. Days later, the villagers found Tom wandering in the woods, with no memory of what had happened, except for one thing, the whispers still echoing in his head, calling him again and again to return to the cabin. More than 30 years ago, Camp Videmar was closed after a tragedy that no one in town has ever wanted to remember. 7 teenagers disappeared during a stormy night, and their bodies were never found. The only clue was an extinguished campfire and the empty tents that still remained in the forest clearing. Investigations failed to uncover what happened, and rumors grew. Some said a serial killer had stalked them, others believed there was something darker in those woods, a presence that claimed lives in every storm. Years later, the camp was abandoned and nature began to reclaim it. Weeds covered the cabins, and silence reigned in that forgotten corner. However, the story never died. For the young people of the village, Videmar became a challenge. It was almost a rite of passage for the bravest to spend a night there. Most of them did not last long, frightened by the gloomy atmosphere and the stories, but they always returned, except for one, Eric, who disappeared years ago after entering the camp and was never seen again. This is the story of 5 friends who, in search of adventure and thrills, decided to spend a night at the old camp. Little did they know that they were about to repeat the cycle of disappearances and that the camp awaited something more than silence. Miguel, Carla, Andres, Laura and Sofia were lifelong friends. They had grown up hearing the stories of the cursed camp, and although they all knew of the danger involved, the temptation to disprove the legends was stronger. They decided to organize a weekend getaway to Videmar. Armed with flashlights, sleeping bags and provisions for one night, they set off at dusk, believing that the hardest part would be to endure the fear they were creating for themselves. The journey to the camp was long and complicated. The trail leading to the clearing was almost obliterated by the passage of time, and the dense vegetation complicated the path. As they progressed, the group noticed that the forest seemed gloomier than usual. Even natural sounds, such as birdsong or the crunching of leaves beneath their feet, began to fade. The air grew colder as they approached the site. When they finally arrived at the camp, what they saw was desolate. The huts were in ruins, the windows broken and the roofs partially caved in. The campfire in the center, the same one where according to the stories the missing people had last been seen, was still intact, as if someone had spent time there recently. Despite the uneasiness they felt, Miguel tried to keep the mood light. They set up their tents, lit a campfire and began telling scary stories for fun. But as the night wore on, the jokes faded. The air became increasingly oppressive, and a strange, barely perceptible humming began to fill the air. First it was Carla who mentioned it, but soon the others heard it too. The sound was faint, almost like a whisper in the wind, but there was no wind. Every time one of them tried to identify where it was coming from, the humming stopped. Laura, always the most sensitive of the group, began to sense that something was not right. She suggested that they leave, that spending the night in that place was a bad idea. But the others, though uncomfortable, did not want to appear cowardly. They decided to stay and wait for daybreak. Around midnight, the humming intensified. Now it wasn't just murmurs, it was voices, broken words that they couldn't understand. Sophia, terrified, shouted that she had seen something moving through the trees. Everyone pointed their flashlights toward the forest, but there was nothing. However, the feeling of being watched became unbearable. The whispers seemed closer, as if the shadows themselves were conspiring against them. Suddenly, Andrew, who had always been the most skeptical, jumped up and started walking towards the forest. He seemed in a trance, as if the voices were calling him. Miguel and Carla chased him, shouting his name, but he did not respond. He went into the trees, and when they caught up with him, they found him standing in front of one of the old cabins, looking inside, as if hypnotized. Inside the hut, something was moving. Something that shouldn't be there. What they saw inside the hut made their blood run cold. It was not people, not animals. The shadows, diffuse and elongated, moved in an impossible way, as if the rules of space and time did not apply in that place. The figures writhed silently, projecting themselves onto the walls and floor, but they had no physical bodies. However, the most terrifying thing was to see how one of those shadows slid towards Andres, surrounding him as if it were absorbing him. Carla screamed and grabbed him by the arm, trying to pull him away, but to no avail. Andres fell to his knees, eyes rolling, as the whispering became deafening. Miguel, in a panic, managed to force her out of the cabin, but Andres was left behind, motionless. When they returned to the camp, Laura and Sophia were missing. The tents were empty, and the fire they had lit had gone out. Everything seemed to have been abandoned in the rush. Miguel, trembling, tried to call the police, but there was no signal. At that moment, Carla began to hear her own name, whispered on the wind, coming from the same place where they had lost Andres. Terror paralyzed them. They knew they couldn't stay, but they didn't know how to get out either. The voices continued, calling them louder and louder. Desperate, they began to run towards what they thought was the way out, but the more they ran, the more they realized they were running in circles. The camp kept appearing in front of them, as if the forest would not let them escape. Finally, Miguel and Carla reached the clearing again, but there was no sign of the tents or their friends. Only the campfire was out, just like that night 30 years ago. The whispering was now clear, crisp, as if thousands of voices were speaking at once. And in the center of the clearing, shadows gathered, taking shape, watching them. In his last act of desperation, Miguel tried to run away, but something grabbed him by the ankle. Carla, terrified, ran into the woods without looking back, but the last thing she heard before silence enveloped her was Miguel's scream, drowned out by the voices. The next morning, the villagers found Carla wandering near the road, in a state of shock. She had no memory of what had happened or how she had escaped. The others were never found. The camp, however, remained the same, as if nothing had happened. But those who have passed by since then say that, if you get close enough on a stormy night, you can still hear the whispers. And, if you're unlucky, maybe they'll call your name. Deep in the Grey Mountains, there is a trail from which few have returned. Locals call it the Shadow Path, a route barely visible among the oldest and most twisted trees in the forest. According to legend, this path never ends the way you expect it to. Those who enter it often get lost, disoriented by the ever-changing environment, and some never return. Villagers tell stories of walkers who disappeared and those who managed to return, but completely transformed, as if they had seen something beyond human comprehension. Young couple, Sergio and Marta, did not believe the villagers' stories. For them, the Sendero Sombrio was just a myth, an invention to scare tourists. Both were experienced hikers and had hiked all kinds of difficult routes without ever getting lost or feeling any real danger. So, armed with their backpacks and maps, they decided to brave the trail, believing it would be just another adventure they could cross off their list. What they didn't know was that, deep in that forest, time and space were not what they seemed. And that, once the trail chooses you, it's almost impossible to escape its spell. The day they chose for the hike seemed perfect. The sky was clear and the air was crisp. The first sections of the trail presented no challenge. Sergio, map in hand, was leading the way, while Marta took pictures of the landscape. Everything seemed quiet, almost boring. Despite the warning of the locals, neither of us felt the slightest hint of danger. After several hours of walking, the trail began to change. The trees, once scattered and tall, began to cluster together, blocking more and more of the sunlight. The temperature dropped for no apparent reason, and a low fog began to form around them. Martha commented that she didn't remember seeing that part of the forest on any map, but Sergio played it down. "It's a forest," he said, "the trees change over time, it's normal that not everything is recorded." Relying on the compass and the map, they continued walking. However, the atmosphere became more tense with each step. Although they were trying to make light conversation, they both began to notice something strange: silence. They could no longer hear the birds singing or the rustling of leaves under their feet. Even their own footsteps sounded muffled. As if the forest was isolating them, enveloping them in a bubble of absolute silence. Hours later, when they tried to return, they realized that they were completely disoriented. The trail they had been following had disappeared. The forest stretched out in all directions, but no clear path was discernible. Fear began to take hold of them. They decided to retrace their steps, but soon noticed that they were walking in circles. Each time they came to a point they thought they recognized, the trees and vegetation seemed to have changed. The sun, which had been high overhead, was now hidden behind thick gray clouds. Darkness came suddenly, as if someone had turned off the light. They switched on their flashlights, but the fog that now enveloped everything around them meant that the beam of light barely penetrated a few meters. That's when they heard it, a rustling sound in the distance, followed by a whisper they couldn't identify. Marta suggested that maybe it was another hiker, but Sergio knew that was unlikely. They were too far off any known route. Despite that, they decided to follow the sound. If there was someone else in the forest, they might be able to get help. They walked towards the source of the rustling, but the further they went, the more the sound seemed to recede. It was as if something was playing with them, leading them deeper into the forest, further away from any possibility of escape. Hours later, already completely exhausted, they reached a clearing in the middle of the forest. There, what they found took their breath away. There was an unlit campfire, and around it, backpacks and camping gear scattered on the ground. Everything seemed to have been abandoned in a hurry. Sergio and Marta recognized some of the backpacks. They had read about these people in the news, hikers who had disappeared in the same area in recent years. Panic took hold of Marta. She insisted that they leave immediately, drop everything and run. Sergio agreed, but as they tried to find their way back into the forest, they realized that the clearing seemed to move around them. The exit they thought they had seen minutes before was gone. Suddenly, they heard footsteps behind them. As they turned, they saw something that made their blood run cold: blurry, human figures emerging from the trees. At first, they thought they were other hikers, but as they got closer, they realized that their movements were strange, unnatural. They were like shadows, but in human forms. They seemed to walk and stagger toward them, emitting no sound except for a faint whisper that filled the air. Sergio tried to remain calm and shouted for help. But the figures did not respond. They simply moved closer. Their faces were expressionless, as if they were not really there. And then, Marta understood, these were not living people. They were the lost ones from the path. Those who had disappeared and were now wandering in the forest, trapped forever in an existence between life and death. Marta screamed, desperate, and began to run. Sergio followed her, both running blindly through the fog and trees. But no matter how hard they ran, the shadows followed close behind, whispering their names. The voices were soft, but full of sadness, as if they were trying to warn them of something, or to drag them towards their own fate. Finally, after what seemed like hours of running, Marta tripped and fell. Sergio helped her up, but at that moment, they realized they were surrounded. Shadows, now closer than ever, watched them. The whispers became deafening. In a last attempt to escape, Sergio raised his flashlight towards the figures, but the light barely affected them. At that instant, Marta felt a cold hand touch her shoulder. Turning, she saw one of those empty faces only inches away from her. Darkness enveloped them. Days later, a rescue patrol found their backpacks in the same clearing where the belongings of other missing hikers had been. There was no sign of Sergio and Marta, and the Sombrio trail had once again swallowed two more of their own.